Minister of Labor and Minister of State for Investment Affairs in Jordan, Dr. Mayan Murdi Al-Qatamin. Senior Vice President, the Boeing Company and President of Boeing Global, Dr. Brendan Nelson. And we also have the Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Brendan, if you Ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Saudi Arabia, His Excellency Hans-Peter van der Rohe. Right, we'll get started right away. Thank you very much for joining me here today. We'll start off with the governor of the Saudi Standards Metrology and Quality Organization. We're going to call it SASO for short. Is that all right? Yeah. Your Excellency, SASO is the National Standards Organization of Saudi Arabia. It's responsible for developing the standards for products and services. So tell us, how does SASO contribute to corporate social responsibility?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency, for organizing this very important forum. SASO contributes to social responsibility in two domains. Number one, by delivering SASO mandate. The SASO mandate is to develop standards all over the kingdom. That includes standards for products, standards for services, and that means improving the quality of life of all residents and national and citizens of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, by developing the standards, this leads to better products available on the shelves of our markets. That leads to better protection of the environment, leads to better protection of the public health, and better utilization of our national resources. So delivering this mandate is our core, I think, social responsibility contribution to the kingdom. The other domain is the development of the standard itself. Actually, we started in 2015 when we adopted the ISO 26000 standard for social responsibility. Then we were approached by the Ministry of Human Resources to develop a national standards to help corporates and businesses in the implementation and adaptation of social responsibility principles. So we started that project back in 2017, and we established a technical team based on international best practices. And that team was led by the Ministry of Human Resources, and there were members from public, private, and NGOs and academia in that team. That team mandate was to develop the standard, which is the manual that His Excellency mentioned in his speech. Now, in 2021, we published the draft standard for public consultation to gain consensus on the standard. Then in 2022, the SASO board approved the standard, and it becomes an official standard of the kingdom. In 2023, we, with the Ministry of Human Resources, also we started our campaign, our awareness and media campaign, to introduce the standard to public and private institutions.
Thank you. We'll come back to you in just a minute. Dr. Al-Qatamin, let's come to you now. Let me take you back to when you were Jordan's Minister of Investment and Minister of Labor and Minister of State for Investment. Tell us how you work to align corporate responsibility with the national objectives of Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله.
Name of Allah, Mr. Merciful and Mr. Compassionate, and peace and blessing be upon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this vital forum. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Development, الدكتور أحمد الراجحي معاليك. هذا المؤتمر, this conference, which comes under the patronage of His Majesty King Salman bin Abdul Aziz. I would like to answer your question, Eddie, but I would like to remind everybody that 2020, when I joined the government of Jordan, was COVID-19. And during that period, it was very, very catastrophic, as maybe all of you recall that time, when we joined work and there was no work. I was the Minister of Labour and there was no labour. I was the Minister of Investment and there was no investment. So to me that was a bit like...
Makes your job really tough.
Very tough, extremely tough. I recall going back to that time, I tried to convince the government, there was a debate about supporting government employees, actually private sector workers. So I was putting an argument saying that, look, why don't we subsidize wages? They said, we don't have money. I said, no, we have some money. Maybe there is some money in the Social Securities Corporation, which I was the chair of. They said, where exactly that money is? I said, it's the Labor Injuries Fund. They said, but that is for the Labor Injuries Fund. We should only use it for work-related injuries. I said, well, that's the point. We have the biggest injury today where there is no work. So we have to use the money and at least pay people to go to work, to get injured, and then pay them. It was a very tough time, and for investment, it was the same case. But I would like to point out something here. I think I have high expectations of this conference and forum because it comes from Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh. Very important to note that prior to 2016, before the vision was launched by His Highness Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the situation was extremely different. So when you look at various aspects of the economy and across all fronts, you would find a lot of achievements. If we look at the economic development, for example, we look at GDP, which was 600 billion, 46 million, 646 billion. In 2023, it reached 789. But 50% of that comes from non-oil related, which is massive achievement. If you look at women in the workforce, it was 17%, now it is 35.5. So I think this forum coming from Saudi Arabia has a lot of promises for social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. In Jordan, like many other countries, we have to work through regulation and incentivization. And if you look at the investment, for example, we try to do it through regulation. And within regulation, we had a lot of incentives. So, for example, the investment law encourages investors to invest in underdeveloped areas and regions and zones. The objective is to align that with national objectives of economic development in rural areas and employing Jordanians. In labor, you do the same thing. We have the National Employment Program, for example, which is linked entirely to trying to help organizations navigate through the international labor standards and try to align their practices with best practices within the labor. So in that way, we try to do it like many other countries, but I think more of incentives rather than regulation.
Okay. We'll come back to you as well. Ambassador van der Woord, let's move it away from the kingdom for a moment over to Europe. Tell us about the developments in Europe in particular and how corporate social responsibility gradually developed into the EU guidelines on responsible business conduct. And I wonder if you feel that companies should worry about these, should they embrace the developments, and what are the implications? How does it fit into the Saudi Arabian context?
Thank you, Edie, and please allow me to say it's an honor and pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to organize this event, because we think that this will be a topic which only will gain on interest and importance. Europe, corporate social responsibility started as companies giving back to society. Filling gaps, education, strengthening civil society, gender issues. At a certain moment, though, all layers of society in Europe were saying, okay, is this enough? Does this do enough for, let's say, sustainability in Europe and even global sustainability? If I buy my jeans, if I buy my jackets, do I have the right to know how it's produced, where does it come from? How sustainable is it? At a certain moment, a few member states within the European Union started or planned to start legislation, national legislation. Before that, there were international rules like the OECD guidelines or the UN principle on business responsible behavior. But those are not mandatory. So society and businesses ask for mandatory regulation, because if you have mandatory regulations, you also have a competition element. What is the level playing field? So instead of having different national legislations, in the end the EU agreed on EU legislation, which has a global outreach, because companies operating at the European markets are obliged to look at their value chains, the global value chains, to see how sustainable is it. There is a duty for due diligence, European-wide and even global-wide.
Interesting. So I wonder, if we bring in the private sector, Dr. Brendan, you represent a global company, Boeing. How does your approach to corporate social responsibility depend on what region or what country you're operating in?
Well, thank you, Edie. It's a privilege to be a part of this, and I particularly congratulate the Crown Prince for Vision 2030 and the Ministry for doing this. The reason we do this is because this is a critical measure of a caring society and of a caring corporation. It doesn't matter what we do with our companies, our countries or our lives. If we are not enriching and enhancing and advancing the well-being of other human beings, then we have achieved very little. For us globally, we invest very heavily in corporate social responsibility. A part of that, of course, in sustainability means complying with regulations, and whether it's water management, energy use, recycling, all of those things. It's well known that the Boeing company at the moment faces significant challenges. We're carrying $57 billion US in debt. We've not made a profit for 6 years. At no stage, and by the way, I'm on the Executive Council of the company, I oversee all of the operations, everything outside the United States. At no stage have I been party to any conversation that's anything other than what more can we do. So our programs and our support align with the culture of the countries within which we work. We are in 65 countries. We have our own values and standards and priorities, but we make sure that we are respectful of the cultures of the countries within which we work. We make sure that the regulations and laws within those countries are the minimum that we meet. Often we exceed whatever is required in a country where we are working.
Can you give me an example?
Our own standards and values.
Can you give me an example of how you might exceed the
well, in a particular country, for example, there may be regulations about carbon emissions, about the use of water, or how waste is managed. And so what we do in some countries, those standards are very high. Europe is one region, of course, where they're very high. And of course we meet them. But in other parts of the world, they are much lower, particularly in developing countries. We apply our standards to those. The other thing that's important to us is to look at what is, say, for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, what is the vision of the Crown Prince? So innovation, infrastructure, tourism, diversifying the economy. So we look at that and say, how can we support the Crown Prince in this social and economic revolution that's occurring within the kingdom? That certainly aligns with the values and priorities we have. I ask then our country leadership in Saudi Arabia, what do you believe are the priorities that we should invest in to meet, not to have Washington DC impose on Saudi Arabia what we do in
very collaborative
in corporate social responsibility, but in other words that it's informed by what the kingdom needs from us. So investing in education, in training, the empowerment of women, to support children with disabilities, a whole range of things which indirectly and directly serve the interests of the kingdom and also serve our own.
Interesting. Well, let's take a look at that collaborative approach and bring it back to Saudi Arabia. And I wonder, Your Excellency, you spoke a moment ago about the social responsibility standard. What value does that standard bring to the private sector here in the kingdom?
Well, before I start answering the question, I'd like to clarify a misconception about social responsibility. Social responsibility is not only community and social development. It covers many aspects. It covers environmental protection. It covers human rights issues. It covers consumer issues and organizational governance. So we have to look at this broad perspective for social responsibility. Going back to the standard, as I mentioned before, SASO published the SASO 2990 standard for social responsibility. The main value of that standard is to help companies institutionalize the implementation of social responsibility within their organization. It covers issues related to how to provide the financial resources. What are the skills needed? What strategy they should take to cover social responsibility mission they have. And so many other aspects in the standard that will lead to better satisfaction from employees and also better branding for the company when it delivers its services to its customers. Again, that will lead a trust from customers for the services of that company and definitely better business. So the standard is a guideline for organizations that will help them to put social or to execute their initiatives for social responsibility in a systematic manner.
Interesting. So, Dr. Al-Qatamin, let's speak about how Jordan used both regulation and incentives to promote corporate responsibility. Give me an example of each, and do you believe that Jordan is moving towards expectation, or is it still part of incentives?
Well, very interesting question. I think before we answer the question, I would like to point out that there is a huge lack of education globally with regard to the benefits of corporate social responsibility and its impact on corporates. We all know that investors love corporates that are socially responsible. 85% of investors prefer to invest in companies who are responsible. And 91% would probably divest from companies who are seen to be deviating away from that. Customers love it, employees love it, governments love it, we love it, everyone loves it. So why don't corporates move into corporate social responsibility without being pushed regulation or incentivized? I think the incentive is already there, but the awareness is not. Going back to the question, regulation plays an important role, but incentives play a better role, I think, so far. With regulation, you can do little. For example, the labor law in Jordan dictates that any corporate with a certain size must employ 4% of their workers must be from people with special needs. That's regulation. Now, are they following that or not? That's compliance. Incentives, we have in the Ministry of Labor, for example, the Golden List program, which I think it's already in Saudi Arabia as well, and many other countries, where there are incentives for corporates who have labor standards, which are, ethical, health and safety, and so forth. Expectation, I think the big organizations in Jordan are driving that wave. The Central Bank of Jordan, for example, is requiring financial institutions to have reporting mechanisms for ESG. That's voluntarily, but it's not forced. I think in the future it will be the stock exchange, the Amman Stock Commissions or Securities Commission already asked the public companies, publicly listed companies, also to have ESG within their practices. I think that is very important because we're trying to tackle big corporates like financial institutions. We're trying to tackle publicly listed companies to start with. Moving more towards more regulation and making it a standard, I think with education, going back to the same point, with education, I think the society itself, because social society, the society itself is rewarding companies, corporates with social responsibility. And they are punishing, in certain cases, corporates who are deviating from social responsibility. So I think more of regulation would be required in certain areas. For example, when it comes to sustainability, sustainability now is not becoming an option. It's not an option to be sustainable. I think there was a report 3 days back that the 1.5 degree, we're trying to limit global warming to 1.5. The United Nations report said that we don't think we're going to meet the 1.5. And most likely, we're probably going to 3. Going to 3 is going to destroy the world.
Right.
I'll give you one example where currently displacement within a country, internally, around 26 million people are being displaced because of climate change. By 2025, it's going to be 216 million. So when it comes to sustainability, I don't think it should be left to incentives only. I think more regulation, and we see that in Jordan with the environment law. So I think the mixture is the priorities, national, global priorities, linked to national priorities, and then we have a matrix of regulation and incentives.
Okay, interesting. Dr. Brennan, your approach to social responsibility in the kingdom has changed as Vision 2030 targets are increasingly met. Talk about what that's meant for you here in practice.
Well, essentially, obviously, we're an engineering and science research and technology-based company. So for us, investing in the science, technology, engineering, arts and mathematics program, for example, that provides problem-based learning and innovative ways of teaching young people in the kingdom, and also to inspire them to careers that are headed toward innovation and science, which of course is very much a part of the Crown Prince vision. So that's one example of it. We also invested in founding the Al Faisal University and invested heavily in solar power, and those programs are progressing extremely well. The other thing is Mawadda. So actually providing resources to help the training of women and their daughters, to give them the skills to get into the workforce, to increase their family incomes. And a whole range of these things which some of them very directly to serve the interests of, if you like, the Boeing company, but meet the vision for the kingdom. And in other cases, liberating people to create, if you like, a stronger and a more cohesive society. So we, as I said earlier, we look at what the vision is in the country that we're working with. And the other thing that's really important to us, as I said, there's been no discussion within the Boeing company about stepping back from any of this, notwithstanding all of our financial challenges. But what's really important to us is that we are partners with countries. If all we do is come to the kingdom and try to sell commercial aeroplanes, defence platforms and support them, then frankly I think we fail. We fail the kingdom, we fail ourselves. We are a company that has to be committed to building a better world, transforming humankind and leave a much better footprint in the kingdom. That's very much how I see it. And look, I realise I'm going on, but just to say to you that in my first visit last year in this job, I said to my staff, I said, look, it's a privilege to meet the ministers, it's a privilege to meet the defence officials, all of that, the customers, but I really want to go out and actually have a look at what we are doing to make a difference in Saudi society. So I spent 2 hours at the Children with Disabilities Centre. We are funding, amongst other things, the renovation of hydrotherapy pool. And you realise as you go through it that these men and women and their children with cerebral palsy to autism are no different from children and parents in any part of the world. And I can tell you it puts a spring in your step when you meet these families. A young little girl, 6, with cerebral palsy, wanted to have a coffee with me. I said, when are you 7? She said, in April. I said, I'll have a coffee with you when you're 7. So I did. I had a coffee with her in April this year. I'll see her again today. Wonderful family, just typical mainstream Saudis. And you think to yourself, here we can make a difference. So that's what it's about.
Amazing. So, Ambassador, let's bring it back to this idea of regulations, incentives. Talk about the EU and what the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, what's that doing and how is that helping or not?
Thank you. The European Directive for Sustainable Due Diligence answers the call for society to make sure that companies operate globally, or at least in the European Union, at a sustainable way. And sustainable is a large, let's say, issue. Could be human rights, it could be sustainability, it could be CO2. What does it help to, let's say, to get a better world and to preserve the climate? In the core, it's one of the core legislations of Europe on sustainability. The other aspect is also a market access regulation. Because what happens if we have, let's say, legislation, binding legislation in Europe, then companies might ask, okay, but if I apply those regulations, why am I undercut in different parts of the world or at the European markets by companies who don't have to apply that legislation? So the core of the legislation is a duty for where companies have to look at their global supply chain and global value chain and to do due diligence over the supply chain, especially on sustainability aspects, but also human rights aspects. And if they see that there are risks in their supply chain, they have to mitigate that risks, and in the end they have to report on that. So it's also, let's say, gives a level playing field within the European market. It applies for European companies bigger than 1,000 employees and a net turnover of more than 450 million euros.
Okay.
It also applies to non-EU companies who have assets, operations in the European markets for more than 450 million euros. So in the end, it answers the call of society, and it also creates a level playing field.
Interesting. I wonder if you could just tell me as well, companies also benefit from social responsibility as well. Give me an example of a company that you've come across in the Netherlands or in the EU which is finding CSR an asset, not a burden.
Yeah. An asset, there are a few aspects of why this would be an asset. And of course it's a burden as well. It is reporting, it's regulation, it costs money, but what does it deliver to companies? The first one is it offers better market opportunities. If companies comply with the European directive, they have a preferential access to public works, the big contracts in the European Union. Also, they have better market access. So also non-European companies who apply the directive will have a comparatively better access to the European market, which still is one of the most integrated and most wealthy markets in the world. The second one is it offers companies a better access to finance. What we see more and more is that we have impact investors. For example, Dutch pension funds, which are one of the world's largest investors, now are more and more under pressure to look at the sustainability of their portfolio. So companies who apply the European directive, European, non-European, will have an easier access to finance in the market, and that easier access to finance even will be more and more important. The second one, it helps operational efficiency and, let's say, the way the people work. If your whole supply chain answers, let's say, the demands of sustainability, but also human rights, workers' rights, let's say the social discussion between workers and employers, in the end it helps productivity.
Right.
And maybe the last one, and not the least one, it's all about reputation. we see more and more calls from civil society, but also individual customers to companies, show me how sustainable you are. Show me that you respect human rights worldwide. So this also helps companies to prove, yes, on my whole value chain, globally, in Europe, but also globally, we respect, we apply sustainability rules and human rights.
Interesting. Dr. Al-Qattam, is there anything we haven't spoken about already, which is an emerging trend you see in CSR?
Yes, I think there are plenty of emerging trends that are emerging. I can see we have a few minutes, so I won't be able to mention all of them. I'll be very brief. I think one very important emerging trend is merging ESG with corporate social responsibility. That is number one. And that's primarily for investors. As we mentioned earlier, 85% of investors love companies, corporates with social impact investing. The second trend is regulation. More pressure is coming. For example, in the European Union, there is the directive, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is requiring by 2024, I think started this year, 50,000 companies to report on their practices. The third one is climate change. The fourth one is inclusion. It's very important, inclusion and diversity. And the fifth one is, only the fifth one I'm going to mention, is supply chain transparency and ethics in sourcing. And that's very important, and I can give you one example whereby I think Walmart has that in the USA. So basically, customers love organizations who are transparent about where they get their products from, and if the supply chain is already following CSR practices.
Interesting. Dr. Brennan, I know you've visited Boeing CSR programs around Saudi Arabia, and I know that you mentioned a moment ago some of the people that you've met. Anyone in particular that you take away and think about? It's really touched you meeting?
Well, this little girl, Jawad, who also has an older brother who has cerebral palsy, and just emblematic of, as I said earlier, of human beings that are trying to do the best with their lives. And it's interesting that one of the things we do, for example, in India, we are funding the Boeing toilets. And you imagine our communications people said, Brendan, what on earth is this Boeing toilets in India? We are putting toilets into schools in impoverished communities in India, as a result of which girls are going to school. The girls would not come to school because there were no toilets. And that, of course, liberates them to give them education and then ultimately to build their own lives in a better society. So across the board, I mean, we're very focused on, of course, in governance and compliance and all of those things. And we do worry about human rights in supply chains, a lot of which we don't have visibility of, and we want to work with governments in countries where our suppliers are. But science, technology, engineering, mathematics, all of those things.
Right.
But these other things that we do, which sometimes people within our company will raise their eyebrows about, but they're the things that make a difference.
Real people.
And coming back to an earlier point you were making, the young people that want to work for our company, who believe in a better world, they want to make darn sure that they're working for a company that's investing in people and making them feel good about the work they're doing to build, as I say, a better world, and in this case, a better kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Doesn't matter how wealthy governments are, there's always more that can be done.
Okay.
And that's how we see it.
Yeah.
So last word to Your Excellency. Tell us what's the next step in SASO's journey in social responsibility?
Well, our journey in social responsibility is continuous development, and one important aspect that we are working now with the Ministry of Human Resources is to initiate a certification program that helps corporates and institutions to quality check the maturity level of their implementation to social responsibility. We have a similar example with another standard, service standard, called Hayak for customer service departments in different organizations, where we initiated that certification program, and we found that the certification process helped a lot in the adoption of that standard, and also in the continuous development in organization and follow-up on what's new in the standard. Another aspect is also launching awareness and training programs. Without a common understanding of the terms that we have in the standard, it will be very difficult to reach our ambitious goals. So also we are joining efforts with the Ministry of Human Resources in that direction, where we'll be launching awareness programs and training programs, especially for SMEs, because SMEs need a lot of support in that aspect.
Interesting. Gentlemen, thank you very much for kicking us off on this fascinating discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a huge round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much. Right. Up next, CSR in the industrial sector.